So this week on Twitter, the hashtag Michael Jackson was framed was trending. As it turns out, the reason why it went trending was because an article was published talking about the dismissal of probably the final case filed by one of Michael Jackson's accusers. The case was filed against two of Michael Jackson's corporations, MJJ Productions and MJJ Ventures. Now, if you've read any of these articles, you may be confused as to why this case was dismissed. And that's because the articles are not exactly clear as to the court's reasoning. So in this video, I'm going to go through the actual order issued by the judge and break it down for you. Coming up on Legal Bytes. Hey everyone, welcome to Legal Bytes. I'm Alita, I'm a lawyer, and on this channel we explain the law one bite at a time. So if you're familiar with our channel, you might know that we just recently passed 3,000 subscribers, so now we're on our way to 4,000. So if you haven't already and you're enjoying content like this, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. It really is one of the best ways you can help us grow and reach a wider audience. Anyway, let's get into it. So one of the first questions you might have here is whether or not there was a trial. And the answer to that is no, there wasn't. If you've been following this channel for a while, you probably know that when someone files a lawsuit, the defendant in that case has multiple opportunities during the course of the litigation to try to make that case go away. The first opportunity is usually called a motion to dismiss, but in some courts, like California for example, they'll call it a demur. In that stage, basically all that the plaintiff needs to show is that they have made enough allegations. They don't need to prove anything. They don't need to have any actual evidence. They just have to allege enough facts to show that they have made a plausible claim. So if a plaintiff's complaint survives a motion to dismiss, then the case goes into discovery. At that stage, the two sides exchange evidence. They have depositions, they produce documents for one another, they answer all kinds of questions. Then, once enough evidence has been exchanged, both sides have the opportunity to file what's called a motion for summary judgment. In most cases, it's probably going to be the defendant, but the plaintiff can also file one. In a motion for summary judgment, the party basically makes an argument to the judge saying, you know what, Your Honor, there is not enough evidence in this case that a reasonable jury could ever side with the opposing side. So because of that, this case should be ended before it has to go in front of a jury, because if we were to do that, it really would just be a huge waste of the court's resources. So when a defendant files a motion for summary judgment, usually the argument that they're making is that the plaintiff does not have sufficient evidence to prove one or more elements of a particular claim. And because a plaintiff has a burden of proving every single element of every single claim, if they don't meet one particular element of a claim, that claim gets dismissed. So in the analysis of a motion for summary judgment, the judge is looking for any sort of disputed facts that could possibly give rise to the plaintiff's claim. If on a particular salient issue to the litigation there aren't any disputed facts, then the judge is going to dismiss that claim. Okay, so let's get into a breakdown of the court's analysis. So in a motion for summary judgment, the defendant can ask to either dismiss just one or two claims or the entire lawsuit. Obviously, if they're going to ask to dismiss the entire lawsuit, that means all of the claims need to be dismissed. And in this case, the defendant was in fact asking to dismiss the whole thing. So let's start with what the plaintiff was even claiming in the first place. So basically there were 6 causes of action. 4 of them were negligence type claims, and then another one was intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the final one was breach of fiduciary duty. Because those 4 negligence claims were similar enough for purposes of the court's analysis, the court decided to group them all together under basically a negligence claim. So although the 4 different negligence claims have a little bit of difference between them, they all have the same basic elements. First, the plaintiff had to show that the defendant had a duty of care to the plaintiff. Second, they had to show that the defendant breached that duty. Third, the plaintiff had to show that they were injured. And fourth, they had to show that the plaintiff's injury was proximately caused by the defendant's breach. In this case, the court focused on the element of duty. So anytime a plaintiff tries to hold a defendant liable for the conduct that was committed by someone entirely different than the defendant, the court is going to start with the proposition that, generally speaking, we're not responsible for the conduct of other people. So as a general matter, the corporate defendants are not responsible for the actions of Michael Jackson. However, there is an exception to this rule, and that's called the special relationship doctrine. Special relationships create a duty to a limited community. Special relationships often include examples like a school exerting control over a student, or an employer exerting control over an employee. But a basic requirement for a special relationship for purposes of this kind of an analysis is that the defendant has to have had control over that third party. Otherwise, if the defendant did not have control over them, then you can't hold them liable for the activity of the other person. And if you take a step back and look at that on kind of a policy level, it makes sense. The law doesn't necessarily want to hold people guilty by association, right? Or in this case, liable by association. We shouldn't be held liable for the things that our friends do just because we're friends with them. Likewise, if we're in a business relationship with another entity or another person, the same thing should be true, right? So that element of control is really what's most important here. Now, in this case, the plaintiff argued that the defendants actually did have control over Michael Jackson, but chose not to exert it. The examples that the plaintiff used were board members of the corporations and employees of the corporations, who the plaintiff said could exert control over Michael Jackson. However, the court did not agree with the plaintiff on either of these points. You see, when it comes to board members of a corporation, where that corporation has a single shareholder, that shareholder has the ability to remove board members from that corporation. And in this case, Michael Jackson was in fact the single shareholder of both corporations. So where he can easily remove any of the board members for disagreeing with him or for any kind of reason at all, you really can't see that they had any kind of control over him. And as to the plaintiff's point about employees, the court also disagreed with them there. The defendants provided evidence of Michael Jackson overruling employees on multiple occasions. And as it turns out, the only evidence that the plaintiff had showing that the employees could overrule Michael Jackson's wishes was as to the delivery of packages and precisely the location of the delivery of those packages to his residence. None of their evidence reached to the level of any sort of control over Michael's personal life or professional life decisions. And because the plaintiff is the one that has the burden of showing that the defendant had control over Michael Jackson, the lack of evidence ends up falling on the plaintiff's shoulders as well. So if the plaintiff doesn't have enough evidence to prove it, then that claim pretty much goes away. So because the court found that the defendant did not have adequate control over Michael Jackson's behavior, the court also found that there was no special relationship and therefore that the defendant did not owe a duty of care to the plaintiff. Now, even with that, the court did allow for one last point. Now, if the court finds that there was no special relationship between the defendant and the third party, there's one more way that the defendants can be held liable. And that is in a case where the defendant was the one that created the peril. So think, for example, of a person driving recklessly. By driving recklessly, the driver is creating a certain hazardous condition and therefore creating a peril. So if they end up harming another person as a result, they do have a duty of care there. In this case, however, the court found that there really was no evidence to suggest that the defendants created any sort of peril in this case. So as a result, the court dismissed all of those 4 negligence claims. So out of the 6 that were brought by the plaintiff, that leaves 2 more. Of those last 2, the first one is intentional infliction of emotional distress, also known as IIED, because it's kind of a mouthful. Now, in order to hold a defendant liable for IIED, the plaintiff has to meet 4 elements. The first is defendant engaged in a particular conduct. Second, the defendant's conduct was extreme and outrageous. Third, the plaintiff has to show that the defendant engaged in that conduct with the intent of causing plaintiff severe emotional distress, or at the very least, with reckless disregard to the probability of causing that severe emotional distress. And finally, the plaintiff has to show that the defendant actually caused plaintiff severe emotional distress. Now, in this case, the plaintiff made this allegation against 2 corporations. But as the court pointed out, only a person, like a person, can be held liable for IIED. I say person because sometimes corporations are treated as a person, but not so much in this case. When it comes to entities, you can't hold them liable for IIED. So because of that, the court dismissed this claim as well. And finally, the court looked at the plaintiff's claim for breach of fiduciary duty. In order to prove a claim of breach of fiduciary duty, a plaintiff has to meet 4 elements. First, the plaintiff has to show that the defendant was acting as a fiduciary for plaintiff. Second, the plaintiff has to show that the defendant breached that duty. Third, the plaintiff has to show that they suffered harm as a result. And finally, the plaintiff has to show that it was defendant's breach that caused that harm. For this one, the court focused on the fact that there needs to be evidence of a fiduciary relationship. As the court pointed out in this order, that has to happen in one of 2 ways. The first is when the defendant knowingly undertakes to act on the behalf of and for the benefit of the plaintiff. And the second is when they enter into a relationship that imposes that undertaking as a matter of law. In this case, the court found that while the plaintiff may have entered into a trusting relationship with Michael Jackson, there was no evidence to suggest that the plaintiff had done the same with the defendants. So because there was no trusting relationship, there was no fiduciary relationship, and therefore there could not be any fiduciary breach. And with that, out of the plaintiff's 6 causes of action, none were left standing as a result of the court's analysis here. So does that mean that there's no evidence of Michael Jackson's wrongdoing here? Well, no, not exactly. So you can probably tell by now that this analysis really wasn't so much about whether or not Michael Jackson did the things that the plaintiff alleged he did, but rather whether or not that kind of liability can be extended to the corporations that were the defendants here. And because the court determined that the liability couldn't stick to these particular defendants, there was no one left in the case that really could be stuck to. So that's the court's conclusion. What do you think? Do you agree here or disagree? Let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, I hope you found this interesting or informative, and if you did, we would love it if you'd hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you really want to support us heading towards our next growth milestone, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. That way you can find out when our next video is uploaded. See you in the next video.